The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats. James Carter adjusted his tie as he sank into the plush leather of his first-class seat. He allowed himself a rare moment of indulgence, sipping the pre-flight champagne offered by the flight attendant. The morning had been chaotic, but now he had a few hours to breathe before stepping into the most important meeting of his career. "Excuse me, sir," a voice interrupted his thoughts. James looked up to see Karen Mitchell, the flight's head stewardess, standing over him. Her crisp uniform was immaculate, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun. Despite her professional smile, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Yes," James replied, his tone polite. Karen glanced at the tablet in her hand and back at him. "I'm sorry, but there seems to be a mistake. This seat is reserved for a first-class passenger." James raised an eyebrow, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. "I am a first-class passenger." Karen's smile tightened. "Perhaps you didn't hear me. This section is for first-class passengers only. Could I see your ticket, please?" The surrounding passengers, most of them dressed in tailored suits or designer dresses, began to take notice. A murmur rippled through the cabin as heads turned toward the exchange. James reached into his pocket and retrieved his ticket. He handed it to Karen without a word, feeling the heat of embarrassment creeping up his neck. Karen studied the ticket, her brow furrowing. This is unusual. Let me verify this with the system." She walked briskly toward the service area, leaving James sitting there, painfully aware of the curious eyes around him. An older man in the seat across the aisle leaned toward him, his voice dripping with condescension. "Don't worry, buddy. Happens all the time. You probably meant to book economy, right?" James forced a polite smile. "No, I didn't." The man chuckled, clearly amused at his own joke. James turned his attention to the window, willing the situation to be over quickly. A few moments later, Karen returned, her expression still uncertain. "Sir, I've checked the system, and it says this ticket is valid." However, she hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "We've had some issues with fraudulent bookings recently. I'll need to ask you to move to economy while we investigate further." James blinked, stunned by her words. "Excuse me?" Karen's tone grew firmer, though her voice remained low enough to seem polite. "It's company policy. We need to ensure all passengers are seated according to their ticket class." "I've already shown you my ticket," James said evenly, keeping his voice calm despite the growing tension in his chest. "It's valid. I'm not moving." Karen's cheeks flushed, and she glanced around, noticing that more passengers were now openly watching the exchange. "Sir, I don't mean to cause any inconvenience, but you need to comply with the rules. Otherwise, I'll have to escalate this." James leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. "Feel free to escalate, then. I've paid for this seat, and I intend to stay in it." Karen pressed her lips into a thin line and gestured toward another flight attendant, who approached with an apologetic expression. "Is there a problem here?" the younger woman asked. Before James could answer, Karen spoke over him. "Yes, there's a seating issue. I'm asking this passenger to move to economy while we resolve it." James let out a slow breath, his patience wearing thin. "There's no issue with my seat. The only issue here is your assumption that I don't belong." Karen's eyes widened slightly, and her professional demeanor faltered. "Sir, that's not what this is about. We're just following protocol." Another murmur spread through the cabin. A middle-aged woman in pearls whispered loudly to her companion, "He's being so difficult. Why not just move if it's a mistake?" James met Karen's gaze, his voice steady but firm. "If you truly believed this was a mistake, you would have resolved it by now. Instead, you're making a scene."
"Why?"
"Because I don't look like the other passengers here." Karen stiffened. "That's not fair. I treat all passengers equally. Do you?" James asked, his tone sharp but controlled. "Because from where I'm sitting, that doesn't seem to be the case." At that moment, a man in a sharply pressed suit, seated a few rows ahead, stood and addressed the crew. "Is there a problem with this flight? We're already delayed. Handle this professionally so we can take off." Karen flushed even deeper, the attention clearly flustering her. She turned to the younger flight attendant. "Please call the captain. Let's sort this out quickly." As the junior attendant disappeared toward the cockpit, James felt the weight of every gaze in the cabin pressing down on him. He could sense their judgment, their disbelief that someone like him could possibly belong in first class. It wasn't new. He'd dealt with these microaggressions his entire life, but that didn't make it sting any less. Minutes later, the captain emerged, his presence commanding immediate attention. His uniform was pristine, his demeanor calm, yet authoritative. He approached Karen and James, his eyes scanning the situation. "What seems to be the issue here?" the captain asked, his tone neutral. Karen quickly explained, her words slightly rushed. "This passenger claims he has a first-class ticket, but—" "I don't claim anything," James interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "I have a first-class ticket, which I've shown multiple times." The captain raised a hand, silencing both of them. "Let me see the ticket." James handed it over, his jaw tightening as he did. The captain examined it, then looked at Karen. "This ticket is valid. There's no mistake." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but stopped herself, her face pale. The captain's gaze hardened as he addressed her. "I'll handle it from here. Please return to your duties." Karen nodded stiffly and walked away, her movements rigid. The captain turned back to James, his expression softening slightly. "Mr. Carter, I apologize for the inconvenience. If there's anything I can do to make the rest of your flight more comfortable, please let me know." James nodded, his voice clipped. "Thank you." As the captain walked away, James settled back into his seat, but the sense of humiliation lingered. The whispers around him continued, some passengers offering sympathetic glances, others clearly annoyed by the delay he had caused. James pulled out his laptop, focusing on the upcoming presentation, but his mind kept returning to the confrontation. He couldn't ignore the bitter taste it left, a reminder of how much work still needed to be done, not just in business, but in society at large. The engines roared to life, and the plane began to taxi down the runway. James took a deep breath, steeling himself. This was just one battle in a war he'd been fighting his entire life. And like every time before, he would rise above it. The plane had barely reached cruising altitude when Karen reappeared in the first-class cabin. Her earlier composure was gone, replaced by a tight, almost brittle politeness. James had been reading over his presentation slides, trying to refocus after the ordeal, but her presence made it impossible. "Mr. Carter," Karen said, her voice strained, "may I have a word with you privately?" James didn't look up immediately. Instead, he finished typing a note on his laptop, closed the screen deliberately, and then met her gaze. "If it's about my ticket, I believe the captain already resolved the matter." Karen flushed, but stood her ground. "It's not about that. I just think we got off on the wrong foot. I wanted to apologize if there was any misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding," James repeated, his tone flat. "Interesting choice of words." Karen hesitated. I didn't mean to offend you. I was just doing my job." James leaned back in his seat, studying her. "Your job is to ensure passengers are treated fairly and respectfully, correct? So tell me, how does singling me out in front of the entire cabin fit into that description?" Karen's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. The awkward silence stretched, broken only by the faint clinking of glasses as another flight attendant served drinks a few rows away. "I'm waiting," James said, his voice calm but firm. Karen's eyes darted toward the other passengers, many of whom were pretending not to eavesdrop. "I didn't mean to make you feel unwelcome. Sometimes we have to make quick judgments, and Judgments," James interrupted. "Exactly. And what was your judgment of me? That I didn't belong here? That I couldn't possibly afford the seat?" Karen's face burned. "It wasn't personal." James let out a short, humorless laugh. "Not personal? You humiliated me in front of everyone, based on nothing but a stereotype. How is that not personal?" Karen glanced around again, her discomfort palpable. "Mr. Carter, I truly am sorry. I didn't mean to offend you." James shook his head slowly. "Karen, do you know how often I hear those words? I didn't mean to offend you. They don't undo the damage. They don't erase the stares, the whispers, the assumptions. And they certainly don't make me forget What just happened? Karen opened her mouth to speak, but James raised a hand, stopping her. You know what I find most interesting about this? If I hadn't refused to move, if I had quietly gone back to economy like you wanted, you probably wouldn't even realize what you did wrong. You'd move on with your day, none the wiser. Karen blinked, visibly taken aback. I suppose I never thought about it like that. Exactly, James said. And that's the problem. The air between them was heavy with tension. Karen looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in front of her. I'm not proud of how I handled the situation. I truly want to make it right. James studied her for a long moment, then sighed. Making it right isn't about apologizing to me. It's about asking yourself why you acted the way you did in the first place. Why you looked at me and immediately assumed I didn't belong. Until you figure that out, nothing will change. Karen nodded slowly, her shoulders sagging. You're right. I need to do better. James didn't respond. Instead, he opened his laptop again and returned to his work, signaling that the conversation was over. Karen lingered for a moment longer before retreating, her steps heavy. As she disappeared down the aisle, James felt a mix of emotions, anger, frustration, and, surprisingly, a twinge of pity. He'd seen this play out countless times before, someone being confronted with their biases, fumbling to make sense of their own prejudices. But he had neither the time nor the energy to educate her further. He had bigger battles to fight. The first-class cabin was eerily quiet for the rest of the flight. James could feel the occasional glance from other passengers, some curious, others uncomfortable. The older man across the aisle, who had made the condescending comment earlier, cleared his throat loudly. Hey, buddy, he said, leaning over again. Look, I didn't mean anything by what I said earlier. Just trying to make conversation, you know? James didn't bother looking up. Sure. The man hesitated, clearly waiting for more of a response. When none came, he chuckled awkwardly and sat back in his seat. A few minutes later, the flight attendant who had called the captain earlier approached James with a tray of desserts. She looked young, barely out of her 20s, and her nervous smile suggested she'd been sent as a peace offering. Mr. Carter, she said softly, would you like to try our signature cheesecake? Compliments of the crew. James glanced at her, noting the anxiety in her posture. He knew she wasn't responsible for what had happened, but the gesture felt hollow. No, thank you. She nodded quickly and retreated, leaving the tray untouched. James sighed, rubbing his temples. This was supposed to have been a simple flight, a chance to relax before his big meeting. Instead, it had turned into yet another reminder of the uphill battle he faced every day. Karen reappeared one final time as the plane began its descent. Her face was pale, and her usual confident demeanor was gone. She knelt slightly to speak to James, her voice low. Mr. Carter, I know I've already apologized, but I just want to say, I appreciate what you said earlier about reflecting on my actions. I've been thinking a lot during this flight, and you're right. I need to confront my own biases. It's not an excuse, but I want to be better. James looked at her, searching for any sign of insincerity. To his surprise, her words seemed genuine. He nodded slowly. I hope you do. Karen stood up, wringing her hands. Thank you. And again, I'm so sorry for what happened. As she walked away, James leaned back in his seat, exhaustion washing over him. The wheels of the plane touched down moments later, the slight jolt snapping him back to reality. The flight was over, but the conversation it sparked was far from finished. James knew this was just one chapter in a much larger story, one he was determined to rewrite, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. As the plane rolled to a stop at the terminal, James closed his laptop with a sense of finality. He had prepared as much as he could for the meeting ahead, but his mind lingered on the events of the flight. The humiliation, the stares, Karen's shaky apology, it all weighed on him more than he wanted to admit. He took a deep breath, reminding himself of the bigger picture. The other passengers began to gather their belongings, their polished shoes tapping impatiently against the carpeted floor of the first-class cabin. Karen returned once more, her demeanor subdued as she helped passengers with their overhead luggage. When she reached James's seat, She hesitated. "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, "I've arranged for someone to meet you at the gate to ensure a smooth transition to your next destination." James arched an eyebrow. "I don't need an escort." Karen flushed, glancing at the passengers who were watching the interaction out of the corners of their eyes. "It's just a courtesy. A way to make amends." James nodded curtly. "Fine." Karen stepped back, clearly relieved. As James rose from his seat, the older man across the aisle spoke up again. "Heading to a big meeting, huh?" the man said with a smirk, adjusting his expensive watch. "Hope it works out for you. You know, it's tough out there for small business owners." James gave him a measured look. "It is. That's why I run a large business." The man's smirk faltered, but James didn't wait for a response. He strode down the aisle, his shoulders square, ignoring the whispers that followed him. At the gate, a well-dressed airline representative was waiting with a nervous smile. "Mr. Carter, welcome to San Francisco. I'm Rebecca, part of the customer experience team. I understand there was an incident during your flight." James stopped, his gaze steady. "Incident is one word for it." Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. "We take these matters very seriously. I assure you, we'll conduct a thorough review and take appropriate action." James crossed his arms. "Let's skip the corporate script, Rebecca. You're here because someone realized who I am, and now you're trying to contain the damage." Rebecca's eyes widened slightly, but she recovered quickly. "We want to ensure you feel valued as a customer, Mr. Carter." James let out a dry laugh. "I don't need to feel valued. I need your company to treat people fairly. Not just me, everyone." Rebecca opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a deep voice interrupted. "Is there a problem here?" James turned to see the captain approaching, still in his uniform but without the stiff professionalism he displayed on the flight. His expression was serious, his eyes locked on James. "Captain," James greeted, his tone neutral. The captain extended a hand. "I didn't have a chance to properly introduce myself earlier. I'm Henry Torres. I've been with the airline for 25 years. James shook his hand. "James Carter." "I know who you are," Torres said, his voice steady. "And I owe you an apology. What happened on that flight should never have occurred." Rebecca interjected quickly. "Captain, we were just discussing how the company plans to address this." Torres held up a hand, silencing her. "With all due respect, Rebecca, this isn't a PR issue. It's a systemic one." He turned back to James. "Mr. Carter, may I speak freely?" "Go ahead," James said, intrigued. Torres took a deep breath. "I've been in this industry long enough to see how people are treated differently based on how they look, where they're from, or how much money they appear to have. I've faced it myself as a young Latino pilot trying to break into this field. And I see now that I failed you today by not stepping in sooner." James studied him, the honesty in Torres's words catching him off guard. "You did step in," he said finally, "and I appreciated it. But the problem goes deeper than one flight." Torres nodded. "It does. That's why I want to propose something. If you're willing to work with me, we can use this incident to spark real change, training, policies, accountability. This airline needs to do better, and I believe you're in a position to help make that happen." Rebecca's face paled slightly. "Captain, I don't think we're authorized to." Torres shot her a look. "We'll figure it out." James considered the offer, his mind racing. He hadn't planned to get involved with the airline's internal affairs, but the opportunity to make a lasting impact was hard to ignore. Finally, he nodded. "Let's talk." Later that day, James sat in a sleek conference room, the city skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His business meeting had gone as planned, but his mind kept returning to Torres's words. The airline had already reached out to his assistant, proposing a formal partnership to develop diversity and inclusion initiatives. As he sipped his coffee, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Karen Mitchell. Mr. Carter, I know I've already apologized, but I wanted to thank you for what you said on the plane. It made me think about how I approach my job and my life. I hope to do better. Best regards, Karen." James stared at the message for a moment, then typed a brief reply. "James Carter. I hope you do. Good luck." Setting the phone down, James leaned back in his chair. The events of the day had been draining, but they had also reignited a sense of purpose. Change was never easy, but it started with conversations like these, uncomfortable, raw, and necessary. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city, James felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just about one flight, one interaction, or one person. It was about something much bigger, a chance to redefine what it meant to belong, both in the skies and beyond. The corporate office of the airline was abuzz with activity as James Carter stepped into the glass-walled boardroom. Representatives from the company's executive team, including Captain Henry Torres, were already seated. Their faces carried a mix of nervousness and curiosity as they watched the man whose quiet resilience had brought their organization into the spotlight. James placed his laptop on the polished table, his movements deliberate. He didn't want this meeting to be about personal retribution. He wanted systemic change. Captain Torres had been instrumental in arranging the session, and James intended to make the most of it. "Good afternoon," James began, his tone calm but commanding. "I appreciate you all taking the time to meet today. I'm not here to rehash what happened on Flight 217. We all know the details. Instead, I want to discuss how we prevent it from happening again to anyone." The CEO, a silver-haired man with a practiced smile, nodded. "Mr. Carter, I assure you that our company is committed to addressing this issue. We've already begun discussions about enhanced training for our staff." James raised an eyebrow. "Training is a start, but it's not enough. You don't fix systemic bias with a PowerPoint presentation and a few hours in a conference room. Real change requires accountability, transparency, and a shift in company culture." Torres leaned forward, his voice steady. "James is right. This isn't just about avoiding bad press. It's about creating an environment where every passenger, every employee, is treated with respect and dignity." The room fell silent as James continued. "Let's talk about what that looks like in practice. First, we need comprehensive bias training, not just for the frontline staff, but for every level of leadership. Second, we need a system where passengers can report incidents anonymously and expect a timely response. And third," he paused, letting the weight of his next words settle, "we need to reevaluate your hiring and promotion practices to ensure diversity isn't just a buzzword, but a measurable goal." The COO, a middle-aged woman with a sharp gaze, frowned slightly. "Those are ambitious changes, Mr. Carter. They'll require significant time and resources." James met her gaze, without flinching. "So, does repairing the reputation of your brand when incidents like this go viral? The question is whether you want to invest in prevention or damage control." A murmur rippled through the room, the weight of his words undeniable. Meanwhile, in a small break room at the airport, Karen Mitchell sat with her hands clasped tightly around a mug of tea. Her day off had been anything but restful. The memory of the flight haunted her, the embarrassment, the confrontation, and, most of all, the look in James's eyes when he called her out. For the first time in years, Karen felt stripped of her polished professionalism, left to grapple with uncomfortable truths about herself. She'd spent hours researching bias and privilege, her laptop littered with tabs linking to articles and videos. The more she learned, the more ashamed she felt. "Karen?" She looked up to see Amanda, the younger flight attendant from the flight, standing in the doorway. "Hey," Karen said, forcing a smile. "I heard what happened," Amanda said, sitting across from her. "The captain told me you were really shaken up after the flight." Karen hesitated. "It wasn't just about the flight, Amanda. It was about me. I let my assumptions get in the way of treating someone with the respect they deserved."
"And it wasn't the first time."
Amanda's eyes softened. "But you're reflecting on it now. That's more than a lot of people would do." Karen shook her head. "Reflection isn't enough. I need to take action. I'm planning to enroll in a course on diversity and inclusion. And I've decided to volunteer with a group that promotes workplace equity. I don't want to just apologize. I want to be part of the solution." Amanda smiled faintly. "That's brave of you, Karen. It's not easy to admit when we're wrong, let alone try to change." Karen sipped her tea, the warmth steadying her resolve. "I don't know if I'll ever fully make up for what happened, but I owe it to myself, and to people like Mr. Carter, to try. Back in the boardroom, James's presentation had transitioned into a discussion. The airline executives were still hesitant, but the momentum was shifting. Mr. Carter, the CEO said finally, if we were to implement these changes, would you be willing to partner with us? Your expertise in leadership and inclusion could be invaluable. James leaned back in his chair, considering the offer. He'd come here to push for change, not to join their team. But the idea of turning this moment into a movement was tempting. I'll consider it, he said after a pause. But only if you commit to measurable outcomes. This can't be just a PR stunt. It needs to be real. The CEO nodded. Agreed. As the meeting wrapped up, Captain Torres approached James. You handled that well. I meant what I said. This could be the start of something bigger. James smiled faintly. It's a long road, but it's worth walking. Torres extended his hand again, and James shook it firmly. I'm glad to have you on board, figuratively this time. That evening, as James returned to his hotel room, his phone buzzed with an email from Karen Mitchell. Subject: Thank you, Mr. Carter. I know I've apologized before, but I wanted to share something. Today, I enrolled in a program to educate myself about bias and inclusion. Your words on the flight made me realize how much I need to change, not just for my job, but for myself. I hope one day I can look back on this moment as the beginning of something better. Thank you for holding me accountable. Sincerely, Karen Mitchell. James set the phone down, a faint smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't often he saw such immediate impact from these encounters, and while it didn't erase what had happened, it was a step in the right direction. Looking out at the city lights, James allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. The day had been exhausting, but it had also been meaningful. Change was slow, often painful, but it was possible. And that, he realized, was worth every awkward conversation, every moment of tension, every step forward. Months had passed since the infamous Flight 217, but its ripple effects were still being felt. James Carter's partnership with the airline had turned into a high-profile initiative called Above Bias, a comprehensive program designed to address systemic inequality within the company and beyond. What started as a tense confrontation at 30,000 feet had blossomed into a movement for meaningful change. In the months following the incident, James split his time between running his technology empire and consulting with the airline. His involvement ensured that diversity training wasn't just another checkbox exercise. It was practical, interactive, and impactful. Employees at all levels participated in workshops, open dialogues, and mentorship programs aimed at fostering a more inclusive workplace culture. Karen Mitchell was one of the first to sign up. The break room at the airline's training facility was buzzing with conversation. Karen sat at a table, clutching a folder filled with notes and handouts from her latest workshop. She had completed the first phase of the Above Bias training and was now helping to facilitate sessions for her peers. Amanda, the younger flight attendant who had supported her during the fallout, plopped down in the seat beside her. How does it feel to be the face of progress? Amanda teased with a grin. Karen chuckled softly, though her cheeks flushed. Hardly the face of anything. I'm just trying to make up for my mistakes. Well, Amanda said, nudging her, you're doing a damn good job. People are noticing. Karen smiled, but remained thoughtful. It wasn't just about being noticed, it was about doing the work, confronting uncomfortable truths, and helping others do the same. For the first time in years, she felt like she was making a difference. At the airline's headquarters, James stood at a podium in a packed auditorium. The company was hosting its first Above Bias Summit, and employees from across the organization had gathered to hear from leaders and advocates. This program isn't just about fixing what's broken, James said, his voice steady but impassioned. It's about reimagining what's possible. It's about building an environment where everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from, is treated with the dignity they deserve. And it's not just about airlines. This is a model for every industry. The audience erupted in applause, and James stepped back, allowing Captain Torres to take the stage. Torres adjusted the microphone, his expression serious but warm. As someone who's spent decades in this industry, I can tell you, this is long overdue. But change starts with accountability, and I'm proud to be part of a company that's stepping up. And that's thanks, in no small part, to Mr. Carter. The applause grew louder, and James nodded, a sense of fulfillment settling over him. Later, at a small reception after the summit, Karen approached James. She had waited until the crowd around him had thinned, unsure if he'd even remember her. "Mr. Carter," she said hesitantly. James turned, his expression neutral but polite. "Karen, isn't it?" She nodded, her hands clasped tightly. "I just wanted to thank you again. Not just for what you said to me that day, but for everything you've done since. It's changed my life." James studied her for a moment, then offered a faint smile. "I didn't do this for thanks, Karen. I did it because it needed to be done." "I know," she said quickly. "But you didn't have to involve yourself. Most people wouldn't have. And, well, I'm grateful you did." James nodded. "I'm glad you're part of the change." Karen exhaled, relief washing over her. She extended a hand. "Thank you. For everything." James shook her hand, his grip firm. "Keep doing the work. That's what really matters." Months later, as James boarded another flight, this time with a different airline, he couldn't help but reflect on how far things had come. The program was thriving, and he had received countless messages from employees and passengers alike who had been positively impacted by above bias. As he settled into his first-class seat, the flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter," she said. "Can I get you anything before takeoff?" James smiled back, his tone light. "Just some water. Thank you." She nodded and walked away, leaving James to relax for the first time in what felt like years. This flight, at least, would be uneventful. Looking out the window as the plane ascended, James allowed himself a rare moment of pride. The work wasn't done, not by a long shot, but it was a start.